And welcome back to the Jonathan Edwards Podcast, a podcast brought to you by the Jonathan Edwards Center at Gateway Seminary. My name is Dr. Chris Woznicki, and I have the privilege of being the research fellow at the Jonathan Edwards Center, or as I like to call it, the JEC. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the JEC, it's one of 10 international affiliate centers of the Jonathan Edwards Center at Yale University. But here at Gateway specifically, we strive to be the educational epicenter for researching the life and works of America's premier theologian. How do we do that? Well, we do that by strengthening our existing doctoral program, by networking with international scholarly communities and churches, and finally, by hosting this podcast. So in these episodes, we talk to premier Jonathan Edwards scholars about their cutting edge work. And most importantly, we get to talk about why this actually matters. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to today's guest, Dr. Cameron Schweitzer. Welcome, Cameron.
Thank you, Chris. I think you're overstating some things to say like a top-notch scholar and cutting-edge researcher. We're gonna sorely disappoint some people if they're listening to this, but
No. As we dive into it, I think the value of your work will really come out. So first off, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and the institution that you are affiliated with?
Yeah, so like you, Chris, I'm a well, you're not faculty. I hope you will be one day, but we're both at Gateway Seminary. I serve as the director of the seminary's campus up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I'm also the associate professor of historical theology. I've been with Gateway Seminary. This blows my mind. I've been an employee with the seminary for 10 years as of last week. So I've served for 2 years.
So a big party
in this role. What's that?
Did anybody throw you a big party for that?
The HR lady, Jennifer, asked hey, do you want to do something like at an employee meeting soon, or do you want to do it at the faculty retreat? I'm I'll do it at the faculty retreat. So there will be a whole 10-year sort of thing.
Awesome.
But yeah, I started working for Golden Gate in March of 2015 as the first enrollment specialist. So entry level admissions and recruiting, which is why, as we were talking about before we got on here, how I've made all the connections I have over the years in California is I've just spent time getting to know pastors and students and recruiting and making connections on behalf of Golden Gate. So I did that for 4 years. I was then promoted to the director of enrollment that I did for 4 years. And then I was switched into this role in March of 2023, and I've been here for 2 years now as administrative faculty. And during that time, I did my MDiv at Golden Gate and then Gateway, and then my PhD at Gateway as well under Chris Chun, the director of our Edwards Center. So I've been affiliated with Golden Gate Gateway Seminary since the fall of 2013 as a student, when I started at our Brea campus all those years ago, and then an employee since March of 2015. Yeah. And I'm a native Californian, Southern California, specifically the Inland Empire, the 909. I grew up in the city of Yucaipa, so really far east.
Yeah.
So I joke that I guess I'm by God's sovereign grace, I've become a very stereotypical California Southern Baptist.
Yeah, that's something we were chatting about earlier. What would you say, because now you're up in the Bay, what would you say you miss the most about Southern California?
Oh, that's two things. That's really easy. Our families, especially my wife and her family. And they all live in the Valley. Her big Middle Eastern family, everyone lives in 20 minutes of each other, and the parties are the best, the food is the best. And then second is not even close. It's the beaches. Southern California beaches, man, miss them, where I can actually swim in the ocean. Though it's cold, it's swimmable. Up here, you cannot swim. It is freezing. And the beaches most of the time in the summer are cloudy and cold. So I miss our families, and I miss the beach and the warm 78, 80 degree Huntington Beach summers that I used to know and love.
And what's the thing that you've learned to appreciate up in the Bay that maybe you didn't realize previously?
There's so much to appreciate about the Bay. It was funny when I got up here, within the first 6 months or a year, from questions from people at Gateway or family or friends, they're always how's the Bay? Is it that bad? And told people dude, there's a reason this is the most expensive place in the United States. And there's a reason people come from all over the world to live here. This is a beautiful place. As I tell people, I grew up accustomed to the color of brown. Like that was my color palette. And to be in a place that's like green and lush and has seasons, it's really, really beautiful. The air, it doesn't have smog. The water is better. The weather is better. It's not like 120 degrees in August and July. 95 is much more preferable than 115 that I was used to growing up. And then I've noticed up here that people are a lot friendlier than Southern California. At least where I'm at in the East Bay and in the South Bay, where you have a heavy immigrant population from like Asia, India, Central Asia, the Middle East, cultures that, of course, value hospitality and family. I was pleasantly surprised and shocked by like just how friendly everyone was. That was, of course, different though. Like when I've gone over to like San Francisco or Oakland, and then very much like it's like sort of the LA like rush sort of rude culture. But I was pleasantly surprised by the friendliness of my neighbors and people in the community who were just very kind. And then just a different group of people. Like where I grew up in Southern California, it was heavily Hispanic. Like my best friend growing up was Hispanic. White and Hispanic was mostly where I grew up. And coming up here where it's like everyone for the most part is Asian or Indian, and like that was different. That's been a cool experience too. So it's like now I tell people my favorite restaurant in Fremont is an Afghani restaurant, and like I have a favorite Indian restaurant. So I've been really surprised and pleased with the different cultures I've gotten to interact with, and just the warmness of everyone around me, like my neighbors and people in the community. And I've been, as far as the seminary is concerned, like I've been really blessed with the students that I have here in the Bay Area. As David Rathels pointed out, he's like, man, some of like Gateway's best students are up in the Bay Area. And it's because so many of our students come out of the tech background. And so like I can think about my theology class last night. I have like 4 guys who all work in the major tech companies like Tesla or Apple. I have other, ladies who are like speech pathologists or lead nurses, guys who own their own businesses, engineers. Like everyone is really, really well educated. And the first night I had a student named Barry who asked me about Eutychianism. He's like, what do you think about that? We were talking about Christology. And it's like, I told David, he said, oh my gosh, you had someone ask you about Eutychianism and he knew what it meant. Yeah. So it's been really fun to go deep with the students here who are so hungry for like advanced rigorous theological study. So really pleasantly surprised and enjoying getting to teach students who come from like the highest level of academic training has been really fun. So yeah, like the weather, the culture, the community, and just the unique group of students that I get to have the pleasure of teaching at the seminary here in the Bay Area. Yeah.
Well, I'd just say that living in the San Fernando Valley right now, all of our hills are extremely green.
They are.
Like Ireland down here.
Just like the 2 months out of the year that it's green, man.
Yeah, it's so green right now. I love just walking out and seeing those hills. But just another sort of personal question. How did you get interested in Edwards? Obviously, you did your PhD on Edwards at Gateway. How did you get drawn into Edwards, either just as a general figure that you were interested in, or even as a specific academic research interest?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I learned as I've told this story over the years that apparently some others have gotten introduced to Edwards in the same way. So I was introduced to Edwards through John Piper. There was probably my second or third year in seminary, I got really into Piper and into desiring God. And then it was through listening to John Piper, reading all those books, that then he introduced me to who is his dead mentor. And I'll never forget that Piper told this story of when he was at Fuller Seminary, your alma mater, back when it was like in its early days, and he was studying under Dan Fuller. And he said that in the class, Dan Fuller made this comment that for the sake of like ministerial fruitfulness and like deep engagement, he said, I really encourage all of you guys to find one dead theologian and read everything they've ever written, so that they can be sort of a conversation partner with you across the table. And you'll disagree with them on certain points, agree with them on other points, but it's worth it to dig a deep hole and essentially have a dead friend who you can have a conversation with back and forth as you engage biblical text or theological ideas. And so Piper in his 20s was like, that's awesome. And he knew that Dan Fuller had done that with Jonathan Edwards. And so then Piper thought, well, then I want to do Edwards too. And so then the rest of that is history, of course, is now Piper really reintroduced evangelicals to Edwards in the later part of the 20th century. And then Piper had such a profound impact on me that I thought, well, I then want to read the guy who had an impact on the guy that had an impact on me. And so then I went and bought those, the 2 thick volumes by Erickson Publishers with the double columns and the tiny print. I think that would have been 2014 or 2015. And the first thing I remember reading was The End for Which God Created the World. Mm. And I tell people that outside the Bible, that book was the most important thing I've ever read. Mm. Like that volume and Edwards's idea of the glory of God and the joy of man as the dual end of creation, like radically transformed my theology and my life and my sort of ministerial theology. And so then I just started to read everything I could about Edwards. And it was around this time in my MDiv that the Lord really made clear to me that I needed to go into doctoral work, even as I'd been trying to be a pastor for so many years. That never really worked out. And then as I was getting into the sort of idea of what I would do my doctoral research on, I had a very honest self-assessment. Like my languages weren't my best academic talent, so to speak. And I knew that I didn't want to learn like German and French or whatever, all the other languages I have to learn. And as much as I wanted to do something like in biblical theology or true systematics, I knew that that'd be really hard to do. And I didn't want to learn all those languages. I knew I wasn't very strong at that. So then I knew that, like, okay, I have to do something in English. And around that time, I was really getting into Edwards, and I was doing some of my master's level papers on that, a couple independent studies on that. And then around that time, I got connected with Chris Chun, and I did an independent study with him on Edwards. And this was near the end of my MDiv, and he knew that I was interested in doing doctoral work. So he said, hey, let's talk about this. And he said, hey, why don't you consider doing Edwards? And, as Chris is very like tongue-in-cheek and very like, doesn't like to reveal the cards. And he's very soft-spoken, right? And like very scholarly. He essentially was saying, how did he put it? Like, Cameron, in the next couple of years, Gateway Seminary, I can't say much. Like, it will be the place to do Edwards studies on the West Coast. Because he was having those conversations with Yale. And so as I was considering other places to go.
Thing to say.
Yeah, very Chris. He said, like, you should really consider being here, and I'd love to supervise your work. And so I was considering that. And he said, like, well, if you were to write on Edwards, what would you like to do? And then I proposed some of my ideas. And Chris, being a good doctoral supervisor, sort of like patted me on the back and said, Cameron, those, and I remember, I'll never forget, he said, those, the gold in those hills have been mined. You can't mine there for doctoral work. And he said, why don't you look at Edwards's blank Bible? He said that's an area that needs a lot of work and not a lot of people have written in it. And, some of the interest that he knew I had, he's like, why don't you consider it? And it was interesting, Chris, because I would have loved to do like a biblical theology dissertation, like on typology, but like that would have taken forever to do and would have been so difficult. And so he said, why don't you read Edwards? And it was so fortuitous that like I then end up writing Edwards' typology. But the way that worked is Chris said, hey, check out the blank Bible. So this was the summer of 2017. So I just finished my MDiv and I'm starting PhD in the fall. And so I get the blank Bible, the 2 volumes, and I somehow find it for cheap at like 2 different publishers. And I'm able to buy the 2 volumes for like $80 instead of like $300. And just like I was taught growing up with the whole scientific method idea, I proposed as I'm starting to read it, I'm noticing how often he's doing typological interpretation really early in the Genesis part. And it's like first book, right? So in the first 50 pages or so, I'm just noticing the amount and the kind of diversity of the typological exegesis he's doing. I said, wow, that's really fascinating. And I said, I bet he's going to do this a lot. So then over the summer, I read however many pages the blank Bible is. And I circled in my hardback book that I have all the areas that I saw him use the word like types or type or typify or any of what I call the type word family. And then I noted in the margin what was the antitype he was saying that the type pointed to. Mm-hmm. And so at the end of the summer, I come back to Chris and I say, hey, this is what I've found. And he said, Cameron, that's really fascinating. now this fall, when you're in research methods and starting your program, like go into the secondary research and see what the scholars are saying about that. Mm-hmm. And so what was so interesting to me, and then, you've read my book, is I felt like I found a topic that was like just too easy. I'm like, it can't, like the whole time I'm doing this project over the 4 years, I'm like, it can't be this easy. Like, I feel like I'm cheating because like I go into, like, I saw what Edward said in the blank Bible about his typology. And then I go read what the secondary authors are saying. There's like a huge discrepancy between the two. Mm-hmm. Like they're not describing it accurately at all. And then there's a debate within the scholarship in terms of like how it even ought to be conceived. So it's like I saw like, well, this is an easy dissertation, essentially. It's like, well, on one hand, they're not accurately describing it. And on the other hand, you have two different interpretations of how it should be described, both of which aren't accurately describing it. So it's like I bring that to Chris at the end of the fall semester in 2017. And he said to me, Cameron, there's your dissertation. And so then I focused on that like a laser. Mm-hmm. For the next 4 years, and all but one of my seminar papers I wrote towards my dissertation topic. Mm-hmm. And God is very gracious to me because of the nature of our program. Like every single of my seminars, like on Christology or the Trinity or the Holy Spirit, like there was a typological section for Edwards like that. So mm-hmm. I just got to read and write towards my dissertation topic throughout the course of my program. And so that's how it happened. It's just the Lord's sort of sovereign leading to get me to Edwards, to lead me to Chris Chun, who pointed me to the blank Bible, who then pointed me to Edwards and typology. And it was great because it's like now I could write a dissertation on typology, which is what I wanted to do. But it didn't have to involve like Greek and Hebrew and German and French. It was just Edwards. Yeah. Just in English. So that was like like I said earlier, I just kept thinking, man, this is like too easy. I feel like someone like you and these others write like these really hard dissertations, and like mine didn't feel like it was all that hard because it was just like cream on the top of the freshly squeezed milk. And so every time I was so afraid, man, that like I'd find a book or like something new, or like during my project, the Oxford multi-authored volume on Edwards and Scripture came out that Sweeney authored or edited. Yeah. And I got that right away, and I opened to the table of contents, like so afraid I was going to find someone doing what I was doing, and then they didn't. I'm like, great. So my project is still good, and it shows its need. So that's how I got to it.
Yeah. Who was on your committee besides Chris?
Doug Sweeney was my external reader. Yeah. And then my internal reader was Chris Morgan from Cal Baptist.
Yeah. I was wondering if Doug was involved with it. You already made reference to it. So your dissertation ended up becoming this book right here, which is a case study in the blank Bible towards a clearer understanding of Jonathan Edwards' biblical typology. Now, obviously, you've already kind of stated how interested Edwards is in types. And here's a quote from the Miscellanies. So he says, nearly everything the Hebrew, well, you set this up by saying nearly everything the Hebrew Bible recorded, quote, was typical of gospel things. Persons were typical persons. Their actions were typical actions. The cities were typical cities. Nations were typical nations. The land was a typical land. God's providences towards them were typical providence. Indeed, the world was a typical world. So I guess that kind of leads us into the first question around your work. A lot of scholars have focused on Edwards' ontological typology. Yeah. So why has his biblical or exegetical typology received so much less attention than the ontological stuff?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've had others ask that, and I can only deduce certain theories, right? Because like I can't presume motive of people, and I can only sort of pontificate about like what I'm assuming or what I've heard some other people say, like Doug Sweeney or Stephen R.C. Nichols. And it's interesting that you read that quote. And what's so funny to even answer your question is like there's certain quotes in Edwards from like the Miscellanies or his little notebook on types or types of the Messiah that are like really juicy quotes, so to speak. And like the quotes that like everyone would put, like everyone's quoting the same quote or a few quotes, and like as they talk about ontotypes or world types, whatever you want to say, but like then they're not really engaging his biblical types, which like that stuff is all about. And specifically, what's really interesting, Chris, not that, because that thing you just read is really clear that it's biblical. But what's so fascinating to me is that you have these juicy quotes from the Types notebook in volume 11 of the Yale series, that people who are writing on Edwards' ontotypes, and when I use ontotype, I'm talking about ontological typology, and here I'm using the language of Lysan Winslow, who's written a lot on this, that people would literally pull these quotes out and use them as if Edwards in that quote is talking about ontological typology. The problem is, as you read it in context, he's talking about biblical typology. And for Edwards, though ontological typology is the thing that was more often discussed in the secondary literature going all the way back to Perry Miller through Mason Lowence in the 70s and the 80s, anyone who's familiar with Edwards knows that he spent far more time writing and speaking about biblical typology than he did ontological typology. So one of the peculiarities of scholarship is that how scholars of Edwards can be more interested in things like quantitatively than Edwards himself was interested in. Mm. So it's like they're giving more attention to something Edwards spent 10% of his time on, while they're giving 90% of their time to the 10%, while they're neglecting the 90% of what he focused on. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of how the scholarship had played out. And there's, of course, a resurgence now, thanks to people like Doug Sweeney and Robert Brown and a few others who've written on Edwards' biblical exegesis. But still, there is that vast discrepancy between what I'm calling like the 90 and the 10 that had sort of been flipped. And so to answer your question about why, now it's just a matter of motive. And I don't presume people's motives, but to quote a few others, I mean, it's like the redheaded stepchild of Edwards' studies. It's what some people referred to as the secret, like the dirty family secret of Edwards' studies on Edward, because as you know, so many like professional academics going back to like a Perry Miller or a Mason Lowence or like religious studies professors who are like at universities and their divinity schools or like, you know, Ivy League or European institutions, right? Like these are professional scholars and they're writing on Edwards. But as Doug Sweeney said, they had to make an Edwards who was palatable and acceptable to the 20th century academy. And so then they either have to intentionally or unintentionally neglect the parts of Edwards that make him not respectable to modern scholarship. And so either unintentionally or intentionally, and that's where the whole motive comes in, I don't want to speak to that, that becomes the dirty family secret. That like Edwards, in the words of Kenneth Minkema, was like he was a typical congregational minister from a typical family, from a typical 18th century Protestant background who had like typical Calvinistic theology that held to a typical interpretation of the Bible. And when I use typical, I'm not using it in the sense of like biblical types. I'm using it as like he's normal and standard.
He's ordinary.
Ordinary. Yeah. So he's an and like that was the secret that couldn't get out. Mm-hmm. And that if it got out, it would be the undoing of many respectable scholars in the guild. And so that was, I think, a part of it. But then as I heard, it was either Doug Sweeney say to me or Chris Morgan said to me, the problem is that for so many of these scholars who are writing on Edwards, part of why they don't engage his biblical stuff, or why when they engage it, it's just, I hate to say it, it's just really wrong, is because they don't really know the Christian scriptures. They're not Christians. They're not interested in the Bible. And so for scholars who are studying Edwards, like if you don't really know the Bible, like I've been blessed to know it, having spent like the last 15 years of my life studying it, you can then pick up in Edwards like his echoes of like, oh, that's echoing Psalm 19, right? Or that's him alluding to Genesis 15. And so then you can appreciate the thoroughgoing nature of his biblical typology, of his biblical theology and how he's writing, because you're familiar with the biblical text yourself. But for scholars who are not, they're either missing it unintentionally because they don't know it, or they're intentionally overlooking it because they're trying to present Edwards as like a respectable 20th century modern man who, quote unquote, was far ahead of his times. Mm-hmm. Like, as I say, and it's either this book or one of the articles I wrote recently, it's sort of like this idea that Edwards was like this trapped man in like the clerical garb of the 18th century, just pining for the day that he could like just be a pure philosopher and just write on the philosophical things. But he couldn't. He was trapped, but he wished he could. And that just is not historical. Edwards loved what he did. So I don't know if that answers your question, Chris, but like there is either an ignorance to it or there's an intentional obfuscation of it to hide the truth, which was this was a guy who was committed to the inerrancy of the scriptures, committed to a Calvinistic understanding of the world and of God and of salvation. And he spent, as Sweeney would say, he spent the lion's share of his time engaging the Christian scriptures. And then even when he gets into those areas that the scholars love to talk about, like his philosophy or his religious psychology, all of that, as you know, is an extension of his biblical exegesis. Like, just to take one particular point, I mean, and you're a far more well-trained and smarter person than I am on like Edwards's philosophy and metaphysics and all that, because you cut your teeth with why am I blanking on your doctoral supervisor at Fuller? Oliver, right? Who's just a philosophical theologian par excellence. I mean, you take, and this is just my interpretation, so you can disagree with me on this, but like you take Edwards's talk of like God's being like profuse through all the creation and the whole debate in terms of whether he's a panentheist or a pantheist or is he a normal theist, right? Like to me, the reason he's using that language is like, well, what do you do then with like biblical texts that say like, you know, God holds everything together by the word of his power. Or like Jesus is the one who in Colossians is holding the universe together. So it's like, what do you do with texts like that? And in Edwards' mind, he's trying to make sense of that philosophically. And like, for example, if I were to write another academic book on Edwards, which I'm not necessarily inclined to, but if I did, I'd want to argue that like the freedom of the will is a philosophical defense of biblical Calvinism. And exegesis, in a recent article I just had published in Religions, exegesis plays a critical role in freedom of the will. And as you get to the end of the freedom of the will, though he doesn't do it like in the final chapter, he's going through the TULIP acronym to show how his argument supports each point of TULIP. So it's like even his well-known book on the freedom of the will is not just a philosophical exercise for the sake of doing a philosophical exercise. It's for the sake of defending traditional biblical Calvinism. So like all of this is, you know, as I would try to argue, like all of it is coming out of or going into his very normal 18th century inerrantist Calvinistic understanding of the Bible and of the world.
Yeah, there's so much interesting. And just this one question that I'd love to dive into. I mean, just thinking first off of the end for which God created the world, like the way that he starts the book, right? The exegesis is definitely there, but the first few pages are philosophical discussion of ends and how to think of that. But I was listening to, I came across an essay, which I hope it's going to see the light of day soon, which is making a similar case for as you're making right now in theological terms, that theologians have primarily been interested in, and this may be philosophical theologians, but I think Crisp has influenced a lot of people. So a lot of people have focused primarily on the exotic or weird metaphysics that Edwards seems to have, while they've ignored for the most part his, or even focused on like his philosophical like background and Locke and his Platonism or different sort of features and clear ideas and lively ideas, all that sort of stuff, and have for the most part ignored the fact that he's interacting with and has been reading these Reformed scholastics. So like there's a bunch of people who are approaching him as philosophical theologians who have no clue as to what the Reformed scholastics were saying. How that shapes the picture of Edwards that has developed in the Guild, where maybe it's not the typical, maybe it's an Edwards that Edwards wouldn't really recognize. So it's interesting to hear that from the exegetical side, but then I've also been hearing people sort of bring that up from the philosophical and theological side recently as well.
to me, Chris, I just had this thought. It's kind of like how with the Jesus seminar movement in the late 20th century, or other like different kinds of theologies in the 1900s or the 1800s, how often then Jesus ends up just looking like the scholar or the scholastic guild. And he just becomes like a modern man who's just teaching good moral truths. And it's like, well, that's far removed from the historical Jesus, or at least the Jesus in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
So in the same way, Edwards ended up looking more like the scholars who were describing him than the Edwards of history.
Mm-hmm.
And again, unintentional or intentional, that's just the way that it is. And I would argue that, like, up with these Reformed scholastics like Mellenbrock or the others, or Maastricht, that I hear people talk about, you just can't get away from, as Sweeney would say, that it was the King James Bible that was the strongest influence on Edwards' thought and life. As Sweeney argues, and I'm inclined to believe him, like, I think Edwards memorized pretty much the whole thing. And anytime you look at like his sermon manuscripts where he just puts like the verse and then ... like he was quoting that from memory. And it's not like he has like just John 3:16 or like Acts 1:8. Like he has like random verses from the Psalms or random verses from the law. And you read his work, and if you're familiar with the King James Bible, you just see how that language is diffuse through all that he's doing and saying. It was the heartbeat of his life, was the King James Bible. And so the extent to which scholarship doesn't appreciate that, they don't understand Edwards' thought.
Yeah, that's good. So let's focus back on the book itself. So a number of scholars like Perry Miller and Mason Lowens have shaped the way that we've thought about Edwards' typology. In what ways have they done that? You also use the word conservative and Christological. You mentioned that there's a major debate between pretty much two major groups. So what have been the options for understanding how Edwards uses typology when it comes to scripture?
Yeah, that whole idea of conservative and liberal, just so you know, sort of behind the curtain, that got me into some hot water as the dissertation prospectus was being submitted, because the other professors on that committee, they were saying things right like, these terms are loaded, like these are not what these terms mean. And like they were inclined to reject it. And Chris had to be like, no, like you're not getting it. Like that's the point of his argument, is that they've defined liberal and conservative in unique ways, and they've done it really inaccurately. And so that they were terms that were strongly loaded, that someone in the 21st century, it's very political, and like conservative and liberal are very hot button words, like they're prone to misunderstanding. Okay, so going back to Perry Miller and his Edwardian Renaissance in the late 1940s, early 50s, if I'm not mistaken, one of the first things he published in that Renaissance was Edwards's notebook on ontological typology, his images or shadows of divine things. And Perry Miller has a really influential essay that introduces that volume to essentially show, like, look how unique Edwards's thought is. And that was what Perry Miller was arguing. And this is where the term conservative and liberal comes from. And it's really unhelpful terminology, and it's inaccurate. But he said that Edwards's ontological typology, his typology of the world, was liberal, meaning it was unlike what other biblical exegetes were doing in his time and day, and even before and after. So he was a liberal. So he was different. And as I think Chris Chun said, sort of tongue-in-cheek, was like, well, then Miller was trying to make Edwards like him, who was a liberal, and trying to make him cool and respectable. And of course, as Robert Boss has shown with his important work, like Edwards's ontological typology was not abnormal. It was not new. It was not strange. It was like a very common thing to do emblem books in that period of the Puritan church, right? And so that's where even Miller's argument of like, that was unique. It's not unique. Edwards was doing something that was very common, to try to interpret all of nature and life in like a God-centered way. So what Miller was saying, as he's introducing this images and shadows of divine things, is that Edwards's ontological typology is liberal. It's different. It's cool. He was doing something unique no one else was. And then over here, his biblical typology, it's conservative, it's boring, it's dull, it's not unique. And then and again, I'm sorry if I'm not getting this right, but there were then two ways, starting with Perry Miller and Mason Lowndes, and they defined it either more narrowly or more broadly, and I forget which one was which. But those two, so Mason Lowndes then was a literature scholar, I think at Harvard or Cambridge in like the 70s and 80s, who was writing sort of like Perry Miller from like the English perspective and literature perspective on Puritan literature. And so one of them defined conservative to mean it is when an exegete connects any Old Testament type with any Christological New Testament type. Okay, and that's what I referred to as the narrower definition. And then the broader definition is to say when any Old Testament type connects to any New Testament antitype that's not strictly Christological. Mm-hmm. And so there was a bit of the distinction between what did these guys mean by saying conservative? Was it the narrow definition or the broader definition? And again, either way, what they were saying is that what Edwards was doing was normal. It was boring to them as scholars, and it wasn't interesting. So they'd rather look at it as nature types. So that's what they meant. Mm-hmm. And of course, both of those definitions are wrong, just if you know Edwards's era. And then the other thing that began to happen was later in the 20th century, as you started to have like more conservative scholars, and by that I mean like theologically conservative, Christian evangelical scholars like a Glenn Kreider or a Doug Sweeney, as they're engaging Edwards' exegesis, some of them, and Sweeney didn't do this, but a few others did, Stephen Nichols, R.C. Nichols, they started to say that Edwards' typology was what they called Christological. And by that, they meant that Edwards' types are looking forward to Christological antitypes, so that Christ is sort of the warp and the woof, so to speak, of all of Edwards' typology. And this is what I was saying to you earlier, Chris, like as I'm engaging the secondary literature in the fall of 2017, these are the definitions I'm seeing. Mm-hmm. And then I'm just comparing that to what I read in the blank Bible. And I'm like, on either three of those definitions, the narrow conservative, the broad conservative, or Christological, Edwards' actual exegesis blows those categories out of the water. It just doesn't accurately describe it at all. And so that's what my argument was.
Yeah. So what are some of these other categories that sort of explode these two options?
Yeah. So first, Jonathan Edwards, I almost just said John, like he's my friend. He is my dead friend and my little boy who I hear waking up down the hall. He knows Jonathan Edwards. I have a few coffee cups. He says, Edwards, let's drink out of our Edwards mug. So apparently he is my dead friend. For like, just talk about the category exploding. So he'll talk about types for the church, or type for Satan, or type for eschatological judgment. And so like, then clearly he has antitypes that are not only Jesus, like not only Jesus's person and the incarnation, or only Jesus's substitutionary work, like of righteousness in his life, or the cross and penal substitution, or the resurrection. Like, so Jesus' work accomplished or applied. So those are there. Those are the Christological antitypes, you could call them. But then in the New Testament, again, he points to antitypes that are not Christological. They're ecclesiological, they're pneumatological, they're eschatological. So it's not just Christ and his person and his work. So that explodes what I would call the Christological definition and then the narrow definition. Mm-hmm. But then what explodes what I'm calling the broad definition, which is Old Testament type to New Testament antitype. And these are fascinating, that Edwards has a typological schema where he says there are Old Testament types in the history, so like Genesis through Kings or Chronicles, that point forward antitypically to the writings of the prophets or the poets of Israel. So that type in the history points to an antitype that's spoken of in the prophets. So that's what's strictly intra-Old Testament typology, as I call it. And then what's also very fascinating is, as you saw, he has New Testament types and antitypes. So that in the New Testament itself, like there's things that happen in like the Gospels or the book of Acts history that then point forward to, antitypes at the end of time.
Mm-hmm.
So an intra-New Testament typology. So on any of those three definitions, then you can't say that Edwards is narrowly conservative, broadly conservative, or quote unquote Christological.
Yeah. What were there any particular types that you thought were just really unusual or interesting that Edwards uses that you'd be like, oh wow, I would have never come up with that type on my own? Just like a very idiosyncratic sort of reading.
Well, yeah, I mean, so what Edwards has done is, I don't agree with everything he's written, of course. I think he makes some jumps that are unjustified. But what Edwards really did was help me appreciate the language of the Bible. Because, like I was saying earlier, there's few people like Edwards who really, really knows biblical language. The King James Version was the language of his heart, knew it by heart most likely. So for Edwards, like when he saw a word in one place, he immediately thought of the 10 other places where he knew it, and then would immediately make connections because of his understanding of like how God had orchestrated all these things. So what Edwards did is he really made me appreciate the language of the New Testament and how there are places in the New Testament where the authors are doing typological exegesis. And these are the biblical authors. And they're saying that like there was a type in the Old Testament that's pointing forward to a New Testament antitype that isn't Jesus, right? Like you have eschatological destruction that Peter talks about from the flood or in Sodom and Gomorrah. And so the New Testament itself also viewed the Old Testament to have types pointing forward antitypes that aren't strictly about Jesus's person and work. And Edwards helped me to see that because he knew the language so well that he was instructive to. So it was insightful to me to see some of those things. But then the other thing that I thought was, sort of odd and strange was like the ways that in what I call like his other types or the spiritual types, like where now this is where I denigrate, like he'd move from like Old Testament type to like spiritual principle or a historical sort of spiritual or theological principle. That was really strange. But the thing that I found most insightful was his intra-Old Testament and intra-New Testament, because he's using the language of typology. But what I really think he was doing, as we know, should he have lived long enough to have done his magnum opuses, he would have done like the first biblical theology if he would have written that book he wanted to. Contrary to like whatever that guy is that most people point to in the 1800s is like the first author of like the first biblical theology. If I forget who that is. Do you know who that is?
I don't know.
Oh man, there's an essay that was written in the late 1700s or 1800s that people point forward to as like the first essay on like quote unquote biblical theology. So anyways, Edwards in talking like this, I think anticipates what's then later going to be called in the biblical theology movement of the 20th and 21st century of like inter-biblical exegesis or recapitulation, right? Or like Gerhardus Voss, the Dutch theologian in the 20th century, talks about how in the New Testament, like Paul's eschatology was now and not yet, like realized and consummated. And so Edwards, I think, is using the language of typology to describe what later biblical theologians would see, which is like later parts of the Old Testament are echoing and recapitulating what they're seeing God do in the earlier part of the Old Testament. And in the same way, there's this tension in the New Testament between the realized and consummated eschatology of like Paul, for example. And then because Edwards had this idea that all that God was doing is working towards its final culmination at the end of history, that it's all moving eschatologically towards the end, sort of like a ramping up, so to speak. And so I really found that fascinating that Edwards recognized that there was this sort of interbiblical exegesis or the echoes of scripture, like Paul's Hayes language of in the Old Testament to the Old Testament or in the New Testament to later parts of the New Testament. And he was just using the language of typology to describe it. And then that gets you thinking, like, to what extent could you then accurately call that typology?
Yeah.
So was Isaiah, when he's interpreting the Exodus as a metaphor for the future of God's redemptive activity, is that typological exegesis? I think it is. And Edwards recognized that.
Yeah. I mean, there's all sorts of nuances and just thinking about some of the more modern work of what's the difference between an echo and illusion and type, and you can get into all sorts of details, and maybe Edwards is just sort of weaving in between these categories and not really nuancing them in a way that we're doing so today. But
well, and what's fascinating, just one last thing, what's fascinating on that point is that sometimes Edwards would call something a type, which we would refer to as allegory, but he's using the language of type to do it. And then what's fascinating is that then he uses other words that aren't like the type family as I describe it, and that like would sound more like allegorical connecting language. But then what he's doing is typological exegesis.
Yeah.
So he doesn't have like really clean, distinct categories between like this is allegory and this is typology. It's like there's just a sort of spiritualistic sense in which he was understanding this. So that's where it gets really hard to like draw like a fine line in the sand.
Yeah. So speaking of drawing fine lines, this conservative, liberal, Christological categories, they don't get at what Edwards is really doing if you look at all the different categories and the way he uses it in the blank Bible. But you do give two authors who do provide a better definition than the typical categories. And one was by Joey Cochran, and he says a sign. So a type is a sign or symbol that stood in for another value or idea, which was referred to as an antitype. Oftentimes, the antitype was a truer reality or fulfillment of what the former type ought to have been. And then another definition by Holbrook, typological symbols always depict something that is after or above. Types do not just point forward in time, but also upward in value. So these are more helpful than the categories that were being commonly used, but they still miss the mark in some way. In what way would you say that they need to be further nuanced or developed?
Yeah, so I'm not remembering what I was saying, so I'm finding myself in my book. As I'm sure you've done, when you've written as much as you have, you don't remember all that you've written. So on page 2...
Especially if you've published it, or you haven't, you wrote it a long time ago.
Yeah.
It's like things take a long time to actually come out.
So page 265, I think you were reading the Cochran and the Holbrook definitions, right?
Yep, that's right.
So at the bottom of 265, I say, both Cochran's and Holbrook's definitions underscore the lesser and greater than relationship inherent in Edwards' typology, as well as its before and after sense. They're too general to be helpful, however, and fail to include his typology's inherent connections to redemptive history. Mm-hmm. So I'm just saying that though they're like a before and after, a greater, lesser, like they're not rooted in history or like Edwards' redemptive historical scheme. And then in the next paragraph, I then talk about Jennifer Leader, who's actually an English scholar at Mount Sac in Southern California. And then she described it as spiritualistic, prophetic, eschatological between a type's greater and more real antitype to which the type looks. And she and then Stephen Clark get pretty close to what I'm trying to argue. And then I say these definitions prove more helpful in clarifying Edwards' understanding of the relationship between type and antitype, as well as the important role that time and redemptive history play in his biblical typological framework. They come up short, however, by failing to relate Edwards' type-antitype pairs that do not fall squarely on the biblical historical timeline with those that do. Mm-hmm. So it's like he then has types that are also time ahistoric. Mm-hmm. So it's like those two later definitions got the closest, but then they didn't kind of describe what you could refer to as Edwards' more like allegorical typological connections. Mm-hmm. So the first two are too broad, and then the next two are too narrow. So it's like I then had to try to suggest terminology that was like both sufficiently broad but sufficiently narrow, which was tough.
So in the next paragraph, you give 4 features of Edwards' biblical typology: divinely designed, historical, teleological, and on the whole, eschatological. And that's part of your argument for how Edwards uses biblical typology as a historiographical framework to interpret redemptive history. Briefly, what do you mean by divinely designed, historical, teleological, and eschatological?
Good question. I mean, now you're getting at like what a dissertation does, right? It's like you have like 200 pages of just data that then you have like 10 pages of summary, and like that's the meat right there. So the thing that you said that I think was most important to highlight is that typology for Edwards, and I don't think just for Edwards, but also for like biblical authors and people who really want to hold to a typological exegesis of the scriptures, is that it is a it's a historiographical framework. That is to say, it is a means of understanding how history unfolds. Specifically, a belief that what God is doing in the earlier parts of history are then going to point to, interpret, and anticipate what God does in the later parts of history. And then the later part of history then is a fulfillment of and an escatolation or a recapitulation of what God has already done and promised that he would do. And so it's a lens, it's a way of reading history, so that what is coming before is then anticipating what's coming later, and what's coming later is a fulfillment of what came before. And it's the true, as Tim Keller would say, it's like the truer and the greater, right? The truer and the greater priesthood, the truer and greater sacrifice, et cetera, et cetera. And so for Edwards, this was a primary way that he understood how God had orchestrated redemptive history. That because he believed that from the beginning God had orchestrated all of history to point forward to the Christ event, and then to point forward to the eschatological realization of the new heavens and the new earth, then like what God was doing before those things was to point forward to and anticipate those, because those are the center and goal, or the ends, right, of God's plan. And so then God, not wanting to waste time or waste story, is like anticipating that. And so that's why in that quote you read earlier, in Edwards' mind, all of the Old Testament world, so to speak, was a typological world, because it was something that was pointing forward to the fullness of time, where God was fully revealing himself in the person and work of Jesus Christ. And it's sort of like the illustration I like to use. It's like when you get to the airport and it's one of those long terminals and you get to walk on those moving escalators and you feel really cool because you're going really fast. That's sort of what it's like. Like all of history is sort of pulling, or like a river moving downstream to where the river is going to dump, which is into the ocean of the new heavens, the new earth. It's all moving down that way. So that's what, like sort of I meant by like a means of reading history, or this sort of historiographical lens. Mm-hmm. It's how he interpreted God's sovereign involvement in history to move from Adam and Eve and the garden to the new Adam and the new Eve, the bride of Jesus Christ, in the new heavens and new earth, the true and perfect Eden, right? So like Edwards recognized those great sort of bookends of the Bible and then said, okay, like, well, everything within it has to move from here to here. Garden, Adam and Eve, to garden, Adam and Eve. So that's how Edwards is thinking. Mm-hmm. And then when we use a term like divinely designed, well, by that, Edwards believed that these types weren't accidental. Like these were things that God had sovereignly put in place, or to use the language of Lisanne Winslow, like these are divinely designed communicative things. Like Edwards believed that God intentionally designed things in nature to point forward to spiritual truth. And he believed that God divinely and intentionally orchestrated the Old Testament history to point forward to the New Testament history. Like, so in that sense, it was intentional on God's part. So that as the interpreter, you're not creating, in Edwards' mind, something that's not there. You're discovering and seeing what God had always intentioned to be there. And so that's the really significant aspect of what it meant to be divinely designed. Mm-hmm. Discovery rather than imputation of like reader's perspective, as it were. And then you have spiritual, right? And so that was my trying to make sense of this sort of both historical, but then also ahistorical movement. So there's this quote unquote spiritual sense to his typology where antitypes don't necessarily have to be rooted in time. They can be ahistorical principles of like, one of the examples that immediately comes to mind is how there is like this antitype of like the believer's struggle against sin, or like how it's typically with great travails that someone is converted into the kingdom. Mm-hmm. Like these are principles of like conversion or the Christian life that are spiritual principles that are more than just like one instance in history, which is typically how you think of type and antitype, like rooted.
Yeah.
And that's where then the historical thing comes into play, is like then his type antitype relationships are also historical, because overwhelmingly, other than like the handful of times he's moving from, at least in the blank Bible, from type up to antitype, most of his type and antitypes you can root somewhere on that line of redemptive history.
Yeah.
Right. But then there is sort of the eschatological escalation, where you move from first Adam to second Adam, or first Moses to second Moses, or deluge in Genesis to eschatological wrath in Revelation, or the clothes that don't wear out in the journey from Egypt to the promised land, to God's promise to preserve his people in holiness. So that's the sort of eschatological sense of what, biblical typologists would talk about, like greater to like lesser to greater.
Yeah.
And so that's what I meant by eschatological. There's a sort of movement both forward and up, and an escalation that is finding its fulfillment later in history. So whether it's Old Testament to Old Testament, there is a movement down and a movement up. Or it's Old Testament to New Testament, or it's New Testament to New Testament. There is this movement forward and a movement up. And so that's what I was trying to get at with those definitions, is that it's historical, meaning it's mostly rooted in redemptive history. The type at least always is. Antitype not always so, but mostly so. It's a movement from lesser to greater. That's sort of the eschatological movement. But that is also a movement from the earlier part of redemptive history to the final part of redemptive history, and that's eschatological. And then, of course, it's divinely designed. God is the one that's orchestrating all of this, and the interpreter is discovering it. And then this is the way he's interpreting history, of God moving from the lesser to the greater, from the first garden to the second garden.
No, that brings a lot of clarity. I think I'm wondering about the application of this. So if you take this on board and you say that this is really the way that God works in Scripture and history, I feel like that would require you to see the world in a different way, and to interact, live, and be in the world in a different sort of way. So what do you think? How do you think that this vision of God's work in redemptive history should or could shape the way we live as Christians?
Yeah, I think it's really important and fascinating, because we post, Enlightenment, post scientific revolution, have a heavily secularized and scientific way of viewing the world. And to quote Rob Boss here, we don't have sort of like a God haunted vision of the world. Like, where God, for Edwards and for the Puritan, he was in everything. Like, everything had a spiritual interpretation, right? Even as it may have been having a new sort of scientific interpretation. And there's strengths and weaknesses to both of those worldviews. But for Edwards, just like for the Bible, there is this idea that God is always moving, God is always speaking, right? And so think about it, like to earlier how I was trying to argue that for Edwards, like the most important influence on his thought is the Bible, not Locke or not Molenbrock or not whoever you want to try to put in. It's like the Bible, right? So then what does Edwards do with a text like Psalm 19, where the heavens declare the glory of God? Their speech is always going forth throughout all the earth. Or what do you do with a Romans 1, right? Like where God's, not just generally that God exists, but like his divine power, his eternal nature. So like specific attributes about God are like known in creation. So in Edwards' mind, like it's not alien to then think that like when I look outside, God's speaking to me through creation, not just generally that like God exists, but that like Edwards would say, like you can see that God's wrathful. You can see that he's merciful. Or then and this is where I've talked with Lisa and Winslow about this point, is what do you do with like the worldly metaphors that the biblical authors from Genesis to Revelation are doing? Like when Jesus says, for example, that like unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it cannot produce fruit. So the question is twofold. Did Jesus just use that illustration because it just happens to fit the point he's making? Or is it because he knows that, in fact, God had designed the dying and rising of wheat for the purpose of typifying the truth of the resurrection of the Son of God? That's the question.
Yeah.
And so Edwards was looking at, again, as the guy who memorized the language of the King James Bible, what do you do with all that metaphorical imagery throughout in the Gospels and in Paul that use worldly metaphors? Is it just because they happen to be helpful illustrations?
Yeah.
Or is it because God had actually designed these things to communicate these very truths, knowing that Psalm 19 and Romans 1 are on the back of his mind? And so that's an aspect that I think we have to think more about. What is God trying to communicate specifically through nature? And this is where I think Lisa Ann Winslow's work is really helpful, that, as she argues, Edwards' view of ontotypes goes all the way down to the cellular level, whereas a biologist, she is showing where like even certain cellular structures and processes have spiritual principles they teach. So that's one thing, is like, I think we need to try to live in a more God-haunted world and not be content with just general truths about what God could teach us through nature, but like what specific things are there, like the rose, that it's only after that long, hard stem filled with thorns that you get the glory of the flower. And so then Edwards says that's a type for how God brings glory through suffering. But then as far as the biblical text is concerned, I've found Edwards really helpful here. You really need to pay keen attention to the language of the scriptures, and specifically how the authors of the New Testament are echoing and alluding to language in the Old Testament. And then you sort of have to compare like where they're making these comparisons in redemptive history. So like, for example, to go back to that whole illustration Edwards uses of how he says that the fact that the clothing, right, doesn't wear out on the Israelite people as they're journeying for 40 years through the desert and the Sinai Peninsula. Edwards makes an interesting point. He says, it's really interesting for God to say that through Moses, because Edwards notes, like, it's not as if they were walking for 40 years. He said, because of the women and the children, they're taking many breaks. Mm-hmm. So it's like they're sitting a lot. They're not moving a lot for weeks or months or years at a time. He said, so it's not abnormal for their shoes not to wear out if they're not walking every day. Mm-hmm. And so he says, it's quite peculiar then for Moses to have used that language, unless, of course, there was a spiritual truth that he was trying to teach. And then, so you think of where they are in redemptive history, salvation from Egypt, journeying in the wilderness to the promised land. Then you go in the New Testament, and you have Paul use the language of clothing to describe sanctification and putting off the old self and putting on the new self in clothing. And Edwards would say, well, think about where they are in redemptive history. For Paul, he's describing us in our journey from spiritual liberation in Egypt to our spiritual Canaan. And so now he's using this language of clothing and taking off and putting on, that God will preserve us. So in Edwards' mind, that was a type pointing forward to the antitype of the spiritual truth that God will preserve his people in holiness. So that's just one example, right? Like where Edwards should really force us to re-examine the language of the Bible and then appreciate the sort of scope of redemptive history and sort of that recapitulative nature of it, but then also recognizing that when you want to start saying, like Edwards does, that you can move beyond the biblical typology of the authors of the New Testament to start making your own connections. He uses that whole idea of like a grammar book. Yeah. That you wouldn't just content yourself with like the rules of the grammar, but you take the grammar book and then learn to speak the language on your own, is what he argues. So we then want to use the grammar book and then recognize similarities in language, but then also trace that through the poets and the prophets of Israel to see how they themselves are interpreting their earlier history typologically. Mm. And so if you can find linguistic connections between the testaments, notice how the prophets and poets of Israel are already doing that themselves, you are in pretty safe territory then to talk about a type and an antitype that the New Testament authors don't talk about themselves. Mm-hmm. So there are barriers, there are constraints, like the rule of faith, the analogy of faith, but Edwards would say you're compelled to go beyond what the New Testament authors do themselves. Mm-hmm.
And in a lot of ways, that is what preachers do on a weekly basis, just thinking about illustrations for the gospel, illustrations for in sermons, whatever might be the case. Like, I think in a lot of ways, although I wouldn't necessarily call them types, it is using this this way of seeing the world through this particular lens and learning the grammar of seeing the gospel and spiritual things in Christ and church and spiritual truths or whatever might be the case in all things that we get to see and just out in the world. I'll ask one last question. In what ways does engaging with what Edwards gives us here in his blank Bible and elsewhere in his interpretation help the preacher preach on a Sunday morning?
Yeah.
If a preacher is interacting with Edwards' biblical typology, how is that going to help build confidence in their preaching of, let's say, the Old Testament or whatever might be the case?
Yeah, like I sort of said, I mean, Edwards should encourage you to know your Bible better. Like, that's what Edwards does, to me at least. As Sweeney says, he probably memorized the King James Bible by heart, all of it, right? Like, and all of us, right, when we're preaching a sermon, I'm writing one last week, it's like, oh, I can kind of think of like that verse in my head, and I type it into Google and go, oh, Colossians 3:5. Thanks, Google. Like, Edwards could do that without Google, without the internet. Like, he knew Leviticus 18:4 and Jeremiah 28:3. It's like he knew all of that. So it encourages you then as a preacher to know the Bible better, spend more time in memorization and in study. And while we don't want to be like Edwards and spend 10 or 12 hours a day and neglect some other duties, it behooves us to spend more and more time in the biblical text and not in other books. Spend more time in the Bible, memorizing, studying, and meditating on it. That's what I think Edwards encourages us to do. And as you do that and you really have a sense of like the language of Scripture, you might start seeing more connections than you didn't realize were there as you get the language, as you get sort of the shape of redemptive history. And if you really believe that the New Testament author's doctrine is authoritative, their ethic is authoritative, then why shouldn't their hermeneutic also be authoritative? That's my argument, at least. Mm-hmm. So anyone who says like, well, we can't imitate their hermeneutic, I just find strange. It's like, well, we say we should believe their doctrine and their practices, but not their hermeneutic. So Edwards believed that we should imitate their hermeneutic. And so I'd encourage preachers, imitate it. Know your Bible better. Know the Old Testament better. Know the prophets and the Psalms better, which I think a lot of preachers should shy away from because those are hard to preach. Like, those are hard books to interpret, the Psalms and the prophets, but Edwards loved those books. The Puritans loved those books. So it encourages us at the end of the day to know our Bibles better and then have like a God-entrenched vision of all things. And to not be okay with a modern, secularized, scientific understanding of the world that thinks we understand it just because we know why there's sunsets and why the colors are the way they are, why there's a rainbow. But ask ourselves, like, well, what is God trying to teach me through the rainbow or through the sunset or through the flower? And then meditate and enjoy God through all of that.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great word. Well, thanks again for spending some time with us on this podcast. Is there anything else that you're working on at the moment or have recently wrapped up that you'd love for us to know about? I know your book came out and it's published by the Jonathan Edwards Society Press, and that came out this year, January. Is there anything else sort of in the pipeline or that you just wrapped up recently? You mentioned the religions article.
Yeah. So I could send that to you if you want. I mean, it's in the PhD newsletter, but it's a online free article, open access, religions, just last month. And it's on Edwards's use of Scripture in the freedom of the will.
Okay.
And so what I'm doing in that article is arguing against the liberal critical interpreters who would say that Edwards's exegesis, and even conservative exegetes would say that Edwards's exegesis is quote unquote unconstrained or without principle. I argue that his exegesis in the freedom of the will shows that actually he does have constraints. And when he makes theological deductions from Scripture, he's doing so fairly. And that not only does he have constraints in his exegesis, but also exegesis plays a very critical role in freedom of the will to advance his argument about freedom and about the will. So that just came out last month. I have an article coming out in Themelios in the next few months that is for the interested, the two people that may watch this. If you want to read like a sort of what's the soul of this argument right here, my Themalios article will essentially provide the soul of this while interacting with an author who inaccurately called his typology Christological. So I'm responding to a pastor named Drew Hunter, who wrote an article in Themalios in 2018 where he did really good work in Edwards. But again, he didn't accurately describe his typology. So I sort of had to say, hey, like this was good, Hunter, but like there's more stuff you have to consider. So that should be coming out soon. I am way behind in something I need to submit to an online database for an overview of Edwards's philosophy. So behind on that. Now I'm going to work on that hopefully this month. So
my work in it.
What's that?
You'll be citing my work in it.
I know. I'm inclining just to tell this, like, because I may just have to pass this off to you, dude, because you're more in tune in this. Believe it or not, the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy doesn't have an article on Edwards's philosophy.
Oh, wow.
And they want one.
Yeah.
And so last year, I reached out, and the lady who's over it, Nancy Stanlick, she's out at Florida. She's a philosophy professor of American religion. She said, I'd love one on Edwards. Would you write it? And I just had a crazy last year for work and school and family, and I haven't been able to. But if you're interested, bro, I'll pass it off to you. And it's like a 6,000 to 8,000 word survey of Edwards's philosophy. And I think I don't think I know you'd write that better than me. So if you want to, just let me know. I'll tell Dr. Stan, like, hey, he's better than me. And I'm talking with Rob Boss that we may do a joint edited volume on like retrieval, theology, philosophy, ethics for Edwards for the 21st century. Mm-hmm. So maybe like how he's done the miscellaneous books.
Yeah.
Now we'll do one like, hey, let's do a constructive volume of how Edwards' thought informs and can contribute positively to modern conversations on theology, exegesis, philosophy, and ethics.
Yeah.
So hopefully we'll get to do that, and you'll see a call for papers later this year on that.
It sounds really interesting.
So that's what's ahead.
Cool. Well, thank you, Cameron. I appreciate you taking the time to be with us. And again, this is a Jonathan Edwards Center podcast, and we invite you to listen to our next episode.